Well, hello plant lovers. It is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. Thanks for finding me here on YouTube. I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne. Generally outside, there's a few things that are managing to find some space inside, but nowadays, since we've moved, I am now trying to grow most things outside, which means they've got to be tolerant for Melbourne's weather. And that is why I created this channel, because finding information about how to grow things in my climate was quite hard. So anyway, a channel was born. Here we are. I post every Friday, so do hit subscribe if you want to know what amateur ramblings might come forth next week, but they might help you in your orchid journey. And this week, plant lovers, a very curious but very charming terrestrial that I kind of bought by accident, which is a little bit of a leitmotif with my orchid purchasing. And I bought it from, I'll just cover the phone number, Annie's Exotic Orchids. There we go. And I'll actually put the link below. And Annie sells through Facebook in Australia. So a note to those of you outside of Australia, you can't ship living plant material into the country or out of the country. So we're very isolated botanically. Anyway, those of you inside Australia, you can certainly have a look at Annie's Facebook page. So I saw this flower and just Googled it and thought, oh yeah, whatever. But it is a cool, cold growing terrestrial from Central America. And I'm doing all these stupid inverted commas because actually, plant lovers, there's not a lot written about this. So let me tell you its name. Stenorhynchus speciosum. There you go. And in this video, we're just going to look at my plant, talk about my care thus far, but also try and untangle some of the information about it. But more importantly, if you're growing it in an area similar to mine, or even if you're not, if you're just growing it, I'd love to know how other people are growing this orchid, because for me, it's been accidental, but successful. Slightly manky leaves, but we'll get to that. Anyway, I'd love to know who else is growing this out there and what your particular tips and tricks are, given that we understand that everyone has a different way of growing orchids. There isn't one way, and this will grow in a variety of different ways for different people, but I'd love to know the collective experience for growing this. So first of all, the name, Stenorhynchus speciosum. Stenorhynchus, one of those nomenclature words that reveal something about the structure of the plant. So something I'm not that interested in because I'm not, into the biology of plant structure, but Stenorhynchus comes from two Greek words, steno meaning narrow, rhynchos meaning beak. So it's about a narrow beak-like structure inside the flower, but whatever. Speciosum, of course, we have come across in many orchids, including Dendrobium speciosum, the great Australian Dendrobium, commonly known as the Sydney rock orchid. I'll drop my picture in here. And speciosum literally means beautiful, magnificent, handsome. So I concur, it is a beautiful, handsome, spectacular flower. So trying to find information about this was a little tricky. Obviously, well, not obviously actually, but it's described as a terrestrial, but Kew, the Kew Botanic website, describes it as an epiphyte only occurring in the Caribbean. Yet other information though suggests that it's common throughout Central and Southern America, and it's a terrestrial. Now, there are quite a few species and there's slight variation, and it's largely about the leaf and the flower structure. But so there's obviously closely related species throughout Southern North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. Makes sense. Anyway, so quite exactly where this one comes from, Kew says just the Caribbean, other sources say throughout South America. And some will say terrestrial, and others will say it is an epiphyte. Some will say it has a dormant period and others say it won't. So this is where the confusion comes from for me. However, I did find a great video on YouTube with someone in Colombia walking through the native habitat in his particular area of this orchid, and it was very much terrestrial, growing in the leaf mold and leaf litter on the ground, so not near the ground in nooks and crannies of tree roots and the base of a tree. It was very much a perennial plant growing in soil, well, leaf litter, which kind of makes sense in terms of how it's been described by the people. So that was interesting. And it was at ground level in sparse-ish, semi-deciduous forest. So well, scrub really. So it's an orchid that was growing at ground level with dappled indirect light, perhaps getting more sunlight in winter, and certainly being quite protected and at given points on the drier side. So for me, This charming orchid, which I bought by accident, was a perky little, it must be a division from someone's plant, and it had very lovely leaves, but it was really quite small and I didn't think much of it. We then were moving, so a lot of my orchids were just clumped together and had to make do for quite some time, including this one. And it was in a plastic tub with other orchids, which I wasn't able to unpack immediately. So it just sat there. And then I saw this splash of sort of scarlet and thought, oh my goodness, it's flowered. So it had developed a spike and it had produced this beautiful flower in not the best conditions, I have to say, which does confuse me somewhat in terms of how I'm going to grow it in the future. But this is where I'm at now. So I'm assuming it is semi-deciduous, i.e. it actually seems to, well, it does flower and do all its business sort of autumn to winter. I'm now the very early days of spring here in Melbourne. The flower spike emerged a good 6 weeks ago, so certainly towards the end of winter. And the flower opened quite a while ago. Long-lasting flowers too. So it's definitely a sort of counter-seasonal grower and bloomer, which is common to a lot of plants in, say, Chile, for example, which grow and flower in winter and die down in summer when it's very dry. So the assumption would be it comes from a seasonally summer dry climate where it isn't too cold in winter, but it does its growing and blooming in autumn and winter, and then kind of goes into stasis over the warmer periods and then pings back into action in autumn. And a lot of bulby things and terrestrial things do that, particularly South African plants. Anyway, that's where I'm at in terms of what I think the growth cycle of this is. I'd love to know though from you if you grow this and that's indeed what happens. So I had this sort of small seedling plant. I'm not worried about these leaves. I feel that it's going into its sort of quiet period. I imagine a leaf or two will remain. And if I look at my other terrestrial orchids, particularly such as Spiranthes australis, that again sort of goes dormant in winter, so the opposite season to this, but it does retain some sort of leaf, and it does certainly die down, but it does retain a little bit of sort of green at the crown. They're not great, they're a little bit scabby, but then it pings into life in spring, which it's doing now. So I'd say that is sort of semi-dormant. So like a herbaceous perennial completely dies down and disappears, I think this might be halfway between that. Not sure, love to know what you think. Hard to find any absolute information about it online. And it's not in any of my books. And the other one of my terrestrial orchids that it kind of reminds me of, but counter-seasonally, is Stenoglottis longifolia. I'll drop an image of that in as well. That's a beautiful South African terrestrial, which dies down pretty much completely in winter and then comes up in spring. So, you know, like a daffodil or a tulip. So I'm curious about this one, very curious. Anyway, so far, it's managed to do exactly what it wants. Now, the images I've seen, these plants really bulk up and produce multiple crown points, and each one of those then can produce a flower. A lot like Stenoglottis longifolia, actually, although my plant has consistently failed to expand, so I just have one growth point. And the thing I might do to solve that is just buy some more and pot them all in one pot so that I've got, you know, multiple flowers coming, because that's a gorgeous flower, as is this. And so I guess the sub-theme of this video too is terrestrial orchids, because they're not that common, I don't think, in cultivation with orchid growers. So you certainly see them in orchid shows and orchid fairs, but not that often. But I feel, I mean, once you actually understand what you've got and how to look after it, they're comparatively easy if you're in the right climate. So for me here, because I don't freeze, our winter doesn't freeze, I can grow a lot of terrestrial orchids and kind of keep them outside. So Pleiades, Calanthes, so the Japanese and Chinese cool climate Calanthes, which kind of a bit like this become deciduous in winter, but still retain a few scabby leaves and then put on beautiful new growths in spring, which mine are doing now with the flower spikes. And Blatilla striata, the Chinese ground orchid, which is a tuber, and that really does almost completely die down. Again though, some of mine do retain scabby leaves. I guess it depends how cold it gets. So those are really easy orchids to grow because they're essentially your average kind of garden perennial plant. They don't really need that much special care as long as you don't rot the bulbs or the tubers or whatever in winter, so that they're relatively free draining spot, and that they're getting the right conditions in spring, which are generally slightly brighter light and then a little bit of shade. Depends on the exact plant. So terrestrials can be really easy and very rewarding, and I'm hoping this baby is going to be just the same. Now, this particular species is apparently famed for its speckled leaves, and you can see there's a little bit of speckling on mine. Mine is dying down, although we've got a new leaf there. So I'm not, it's also quite a young division, so it hasn't really, oomphed up and got into its groove yet. So hopefully it then produces these masses of beautiful leaves. So it's actually a gorgeous houseplant. It is described as cool to cold growing and to quite high altitude. So my intention was to actually try and grow it outside, but I did buy it kind of just before we moved, which was wicked, because I shouldn't have been adding to my trauma and stress, but I did. And so it's been inside all winter, but in our previous house in quite a cool spot. So now I've got to figure out kind of how to grow it now in this house. And I think I'm going to just grow it outside with some protection now that we're in spring and the weather's warming up. Now it's potted in sphagnum moss in a really terrible plastic pot, sorry. So I will repot it once this has died down and the whole plant's kind of in stasis. I probably actually will repot it then towards the end of summer when it's going to start coming into growth again. And I will just put it in a terracotta pot with the sort of mix that I would use for terrestrial. So I actually use out of the bag orchid mix because it's got medium bark, but it's a bit more granular. I'll probably put, maybe 1/10 or a small fistful of regular potting mix and a little bit of fertilizer. So I'll probably use actually broken down manure that you can buy from hardware stores as well. Because looking at that video of where it's growing, it's very much growing in the leaf litter. So very rich, broken down organic material beneath trees. So it's certainly, I imagine, wants that. And then in summer, wants a slightly drier or quite dry condition. And I guess depending on the dryness of the summer will depend on how far it dies down. So that's my thinking anyway. No fragrance, but look at those beautiful, what are we calling it? Is it scarlet? Is it carmine flowers with these beautiful white details to the lip? It's a glorious orchid. And as mine's still a juvenile, I think once it bulks up and you get sort of a stronger flower spike, it's going to look absolutely stunning and not a color that you see naturally that often in orchids. So very, very beautiful. Forgive me for saying this. I mean, it doesn't really, but it kind of looks like a bluebell, except it's not blue, but just the sort of the flower spike anyway. So it's a very, very pretty flower. No fragrance, but who needs it? It's a very, very, very pretty orchid. Quite a firm stem, quite firm flowers, if you know what I mean. They're not sort of delicate and fleshy, so I think quite tough. And it's certainly lasted a long time. And it's also survived lots of crazy treatment from me, from being shunted around. And I moved it as the flower spike was emerging, which is often a really bad thing to do with orchids because you can really stymie its growth. But it decided to carry on. So it's in a completely different area, completely different house, completely different temperature and light, but it still carried on and opened for me. So a very beautiful thing. So I am glad I bought this. There are many things that I'm not that glad that I bought perhaps. And you know what, right now, because space is limited and I'm kind of moving through what my orchids mean to me, the things that I don't love and are not giving me joy are heading out the door. But this one, I am not disappointed I bought because I think it's going to be stunning as it bulks up. So we've got a little work in progress with this. I've got to repot it. I've got to make sure that it's going to be happy in my conditions outside. I think it's pretty tough and resilient. It's got very thick, fleshy roots. And everything that I've read, which is kind of disparate, does say that it takes a variety of temperatures. And most of the literature does say it wants a drier summer, which is going to be easy for me to achieve. So there we are, plant lovers. This is my brilliant flowering Stenorychus speciosum, which managed to survive all the vagaries of moving. It's flowered for me, but more than anything, there's almost no information out there about it. I would love to know from you or anyone else growing it, how you grow yours, in what climate, and how you pot it, and whether or not it has a dormancy in summer. Those are the key things for me to find out. But plant lovers, there we go. This is my rambling for the week. Not that expert really, because I've accidentally got this thing to flower, but who knows quite why or if I can replicate it. But if I do, we'll certainly do a follow-up next year and hopefully see that it's bulked up, survived and flowered again. So plant lovers, that's it for this week. I hope all's well in your world, that your orchids are doing the things that they should. And I very much look forward to seeing you next week. I post every week on a Friday, so hit subscribe. But until then, take care. See you next Friday.